Welcome, everybody. I guess people are still joining, so we'll wait a couple minutes to see. Okay, well, let's begin. I want to welcome you all here. I'm sorry to say that Dawn Dole can't be with us today. There was evidently a large snowstorm in England yesterday, and she lost her power, so she has no ability to join us. I also want to tell you that this session will be recorded, so you know that. But this is wonderful. It's beautiful to see all of these familiar faces and some new faces. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the book launch for the SAGE Handbook, Social Constructionist Practices, and it's by the Taos Institute. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization where a community of practitioners and scholars join together to explore social constructionist ideas and how they are realized in our daily lives. We offer workshops, we publish books, we have conferences, a diploma program, and many, many additional resources. So I encourage you to check out our website to find out more about us if you don't already know. For those of you who are not familiar with social construction, the easiest way to explain it is to say that social construction focuses on how relational processes, that is what we do together, creates the worlds in which we live. Through our interactions, we create, maintain, and change our beliefs, our values, and what we take to be real. So there's nothing more important than our relational lives, and that's really the center of what we focus on here. So with that background, let me start our celebration in a proper manner. If you just give me one moment.
Sheila, shall we ask everyone to put themselves on a speaker's view?
Thank you very much. Please put yourself on speaker view for this spectacular celebratory moment. So now that that's out of the way, that was a technical challenge for me to pull that one off. So, okay, let me pass the baton to Ken, co-founder and president of the Taos Institute. Ken?
Thanks, Sheila. I'm going to smile at fireworks. That was great. Great Jack Lanneman put on for us and set the. I mean, this really is a momentous occasion for many of us. And think back, almost 30 years ago when we were a small group of people who were giving small conferences in Taos, New Mexico, with 50, 60 people perhaps. Ideas of social construction were hot at the time. There was so much enthusiasm then, so we sort of had more meetings and then eventually formed the Institute. And again, more discussions, more excitement, more sharing. We almost had no practices at the very beginning. We had appreciative inquiry that was sort of on the boards. Harlene's work, particularly with Harold Galician and postmodern therapy, but that's all almost we had. And narrative therapy was also coming into vogue at the time, which was related, but very little. Now, watch this. I mean, the Taos Institute grows and grows and grows with more meetings and conferences and all that you mentioned, Sheila. Over 600 to 700 associates at this point. Enormous amount of creativity that's gone on in this group, enormous amount of sharing all over the world. And this handbook simply, in some sense, is a token of that work. It's almost a way of sort of fixing it, just sort of saying, "Hey, look, this is fantastic. What's been done here? So much more could have been included." I mean, it goes. It's amazing what you've done, and I want to celebrate you for that. And it's not only a sort of a marker for the past, but that handbook now will remain. Future libraries all over the world, it will be there as a major resource for other people. It's a sort of a focal vehicle for sharing. And I congratulate you who put together this mammoth work. I'm in awe, actually. And I've done 60 chapters, 640 pages, over 80 authors. I mean, how you did that. Perhaps I should turn this back to you, Sheila, and your group, and let you talk a little bit about the background of this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ken. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this book is an achievement of our community, really. It's a community that's united around social construction and relational practices that social construction promotes. And, as many of you know, the Taos Institute had a humble beginning in 1993. A small group of us, colleagues and friends, hosted a conference that we didn't even think anyone would come to. And from that day forward, we just decided to keep going. And our community has grown over the past 27 years with approximately 750 associates spanning the globe. Each of these associates has brought their inspiring and creative interpretations of the relational orientation of social construction into all forms of practice. I mean, we have too many to mention and more to be added to the list, I'm sure. But one question we keep asking is, how is it social construction has been so generative? The innovations, the applications, the expansions of ideas, they've not been surpassed by any other approach to the study of the social world, at least as I can think of it. And so it really is, it's like a fever, a positive fever, running rampant. But the curiosity about the generativity of social construction and the ideas, the enthusiasm of those towards those ideas and the practices really is what gave birth to this idea of a handbook. And I think that the idea of the handbook has been sort of lingering for at least a decade. And finally, we decided it's time to chronicle all this innovation, all this enthusiasm, all this creativity. So this volume is presented in the spirit of the Taos community's eagerness to share, to collaborate, and to continue to imagine new forms of practice for the new futures we'll create together. Not only have all the contributors, who are all Taos associates, made this book a reality, but there's also been a very impressive international advisory board for the book, also comprised of Taos associates, and their fingerprints are also embedded in this book. There are 60 chapters by 93 authors, and we're so grateful for all their contributions. And we're also grateful to Taos associate Robin Stratton Berghassel for launching a spectacular podcast series featuring several of the handbook authors talking about their work. If you haven't caught those podcasts, I strongly encourage you to look them up. They're really great. So this has been truly a collaborative and relationally enriching experience. And so now I would like to introduce my co-editors, Emerson Rasera, who's a Taos associate and professor of group theory at the University of Uberlândia in Brazil, and Celiane Camargo-Borges, who's a member of the Taos Institute Board of Directors and a lecturer at Breda, University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. I hand it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Sheila. Hello, everyone. What a delight to be here, finally launching our book. And so I'm very happy to be here. And Emerson, shall we start by sharing about the collaborative aspects of the book?
Yes, Celiane, thank you. Hi, everyone. I would like to tell you a little bit about our process of work. I have to say that the handbook is the result of a collective, collaborative, and long effort. Just to share some numbers, we have for editors, 7 section editors and 93 authors. It's a huge team. And I would like to thank you, every and each one of you who spent time and invested your ideas, energy, and emotions to make this book possible. Thank you very much. In the process of editing the book, the editors wrote the first draft of the proposal that would be submitted to SAGE. But then we have the input and the contribution of the International Advisory Board, who helped us to define the sections and the authors for the different chapters of the book. It was a big challenge because we have so many interesting topics to discuss and so many important people all over the world working with social constructionist ideas. The International Advisory Board is composed by researchers and practitioners from all over the world, including North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They were invited to work with us based on their expertise and their contributions to the social constructionist movement. Their collaboration proved to be really important. With our proposal finished, we sent it to SAGE, who also asked for the opinion of 4 anonymous reviewers. Then, the final proposal of the book was the result of the collaboration between the editors, the International Advisory Board, and the feedback from SAGE. In the end, we had the contract with SAGE, we signed it, and we formally invited the section editors and the authors to join us in the adventure of writing this handbook. The handbook has 7 sections: the introduction, the research practices, practice in therapeutic professions, practice in organizational development, practice in education, in healthcare, and community practice. All of them will be properly presented by its section editors in a few moments. As you can see, we try to bring to the handbook the main areas in which social constructionist practices flourish. Each section has around 10 chapters, more or less, some sections a bit more, others a bit less. And the sections cover impressive 60, the sections of the book cover impressive 60 chapters. But these were just the first steps on the process of adding the book. And now I would like to invite Celiane to share with us a little bit of her experience when we actually enter the process and in the process itself. Celiane, could you tell us how was this dialogue between the editors, the section editors, and the authors?
Yeah, well, what an adventure. That was a truly constructionist adventure in the sense of how we managed to design this co-creative environment. We had some guidelines for the chapters, and in the guidelines, we wanted the authors to bring some innovative approaches, some innovative practices related to constructionism, and also we wanted them to bring an illustration that would make that more tangible. However, we were embracing the diversity of each author in the sense that we wanted them to bring their own style of writing, own style of talking about constructionism in their own context, how they would exercise, how they would implement constructionism in their own discipline and practice. And that turned out to be a very, an exceptionally creative book. So from there, we would just make sure this diversity of format, structure, and style would be coherent with the whole. And in that process, we were working back and forth from author to section editor, to book editor, and then back to section editor and author. It was a back and forth of a very collaborative approach, and really a joy to be working with the editors, with the authors. And I'm very curious, you're going to hear soon how each section editor experienced this collaborative process. But for now, I will give the floor back to Sheila and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Emerson and Celiane. Yes, I mean, as many of you know, Emerson, Celiane, and I were not the only editors of this volume. Mary Gergen was also one of the senior editors. She was, as she always was, a true partner in crime. And it's with deep regret and sadness that we are hosting this launch today without her sparkling presence. But we can say with confidence that she's with us. Her image of this book and her commitment to making it happen was critical to this book ever coming to fruition. She was such a strong force and such a champion of putting this project together. And as much as we miss Mary, she lives among us every single day. So let me now start by introducing the various sections of the book. And Celiane, you did raise a really interesting question, as I hadn't thought about. We now have the opportunity to hear from the section editor's point of view what the process was like. But first, let me introduce Ken again, who section 1 is the introductory chapter, which Ken authored. And Ken, could you say some words about that, please?
Yes, thank you, Sheila. And also thank you for recognizing Mary's part in this. It was a dedicated effort on her part. She very much championed this for many, many years, and thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So, the opening chapter, I didn't use that chapter so much to talk about social constructionist theory. I just presumed that was already part of the background. There's a little bit, but more trying to say why the relationship with practice. What is that all about? And particularly to go back to a question you raised, Sheila, why has social construction been such a powerful force in the sort of the generation of practices? Unlike any approach to knowledge that we've had before, it just is immediately creative of an enormous array, of which, again, the handbook is only a part. And so that was the point of that chapter, and just to share a little bit about what that was about. It seemed to me that what we'd been through was basically a century of, you might say, where science really dominated the whole sort of idea that we could collect data about the world in a neutral fashion, and eventually we would begin to converge on the truth about the nature of the world. And indeed, the broad project of that century was somehow generating a single account of what the world is like, how it functioned, and our place in it, and so on. Thus the enormous profusion of social sciences, and so on. What made the constructionist dialogues important, and they have other names as well, towards the end of the century, was a challenge to the notion of convergence, of a one-world approach, and the recognition that what you had really were communities talking with each other, doing work of various kinds, with various assumptions, each of their own making, and creating worlds within those assumptions. And there was no way in which to sort of valorize any particular group. There was no group of groups that could look down and say, well, look, this is wrong and this is right. Rather, you realize the generative force of that working together to create those possibilities. So that was part of the background of which Taos was generated. Now, what you did in sort of moving in a constructionist direction, and here's where it gets interesting, is that it releases you first from authority of any one group. I mean, if you were in the sort of a committed scientist, let's say social scientist at the time, there were certain methods which were de rigueur. And if you didn't use those methods, it was kind of second-rate science. The whole club is built around constraint, regimens, disciplines, if you will. So you release people from the authority of any discipline. So it could say, well, we could do this and we could do that, and maybe this would be a possibility. And suddenly you've got imagination running wild. Secondly, while the sort of modernist tradition of the 20th century was to make value neutral science, that is, remove ideology, remove values, we'll have one world and everyone will come to agree on that because that will be an objective world where values don't count. What you have here is the recognition that all of those communities that are generating worlds also are generating values. They have something they care about, something they want to do. And you realize that any of those groups also by implication are going to have implications for other groups. So simply to do science, suddenly you are also having implications for what happens to spirituality, what happens to religion, and so on. So you're actually having implications for others which have to be taken into account. Well, social construction says, okay, that's fine. Let's not try to eliminate the values. Do your work from a value standpoint. Be open about it. Be committed to something you really care about. To be sure, caution, question, concern about whose toes you're stepping on and what it does, but it brings back value to the center of one's activities in a way that hadn't happened in the previous century. The third, and there are four of these, the third one was the way in which constructionism invites you to be curious. It is where you might have been constrained within a discipline of some kind. It says, look, these are different groups trying to do different things, and rather than trying to say we are the best and they don't really count, or how can they be folded into our community, it's to say, look, I'm sort of curious about how they operate. What values do they have? How do they do that? So you get this kind of curiosity, which leads to, in a sense, creativity. I mean, creativity is often taking place, or is really motivated by being at the margins of things, where you're in a discipline or you're in an area, but you see the possibilities of something else, open to that. So you got this creativity soaring because we are open and curious to the possibilities that are out there and how they could be used and what we could do with them and how we could use them to make somehow a better world. There was a fourth piece which I was concerned about too, and which has to do with the way in which the sort of scientific view also privileged a causal account of how things happened. So you generate ideas in organizations and education and healthcare and community building, government and so on, which were cause and effect models, which set up people to be caused by others or to caused by rules or regulations. And time after time, those organizations, those institutions were failing. And somehow you set people into causal institutions and they rebel, they are disheartened, they find other things to do, they don't want to do it, and so on. And there was a certain kind of pessimism that began to develop, I felt, where it seemed like we would try one and then we would try the other, and it was always this sense, well, that's not working, what's next? And then that would have to be changed. And what constructionism does for me, and it's tremendously optimistic, it says, look, next conversation, that's possible seeds for some new practice. Let's just talk together. And out of that talk, inspiration. Out of that inspiration, another action in the world, another thing you care about. So that's been really glorious for me, and it was fun to play with that in the chapter.
Thank you, Ken. That's great. It's a great chapter too, if I do say so myself. Yeah. So, as well as being one of the senior editors of the volume, Mary Gergen also played the role of section editor for the second section of the book, which is research practices. So I pass the baton back to you, Ken. You get more talk time to address in Mary's place the research section.
I especially miss Mary. She spent hours and hours with these chapter writers and deliberation about what went in and what went out. It's a very difficult challenge, partly because there's so many associates and so much work out there that should and could be considered, and you don't know what to do with it. For one, constructionist ideas are not just the Taos Institutes. I mean, again, they're out there. And there had already been, this is on practices of research, there had already been 2 volumes of the handbook, the Denson and Lincoln handbook on qualitative inquiry, which was, skyrocketing with practices. So that had been done. The influence was sort of indirect on the development of those practices. There was also a lot of work already in motion on what you might say was new research inquiry, which, for example, on conversation analysis, discourse analysis, whole handbooks of discourse analysis and conversation. What to do with that? And then you begin to think, well, actually, that's not so much a shift in the form of the inquiry, it's really a shift in the content. Shift of the way you look at it, the way people construct the world in language. So that went out. So then what? Well, as I understood Mary's work, she was trying to get work which more represented, I think, constructionist ideas themselves. All right, that practices that were built around that, which meant work that was value concern, which was concerned with social change, which wanted that in there, that pragmatic, what are we doing in the world and why are we doing it? And also trying to keep in motion the idea of collaboration, that we are doing it together. Well, those were some of the framing ideas out of that. And I can't do justice to this, by the way. What you really have to do is to come back on, I think it's late January, I think that maybe the 29th, where we're going to have all the chapter authors there, and they can go into these things in detail, and we'll have dialogue about that. So I can just skim that briefly. As I see it, she had wanted to recognize first this tradition of action research, which had been around for a long time, but was being revitalized because it was so in keeping with a lot of constructionist ideas that we together can make changes in the world that we feel are valuable. So 3 of the chapters are really take off from that. Celiane and Sheila's chapter really emphasizing imagination and creativity. Otar Ness, Dina on Heimberg, trying to get at the way in which this brings about community for the public good, that can contribute to the public good. Hilary Bradbury herself, who edited now the Handbook of Action Research, which is, I think, in its 2nd edition, maybe going on 3rd. She was kind enough to add her to put an oar in for our handbook and wrote a chapter basically kind of talk about the way in which this is transformative to the people in it and for communities. So you get 3 different emphases there. Then you move on to 3 more chapters, which I would look at as more trying to play at the edge of what's going on, but things that are in development, but not fully realized. She wrote herself a chapter on performative work, which has now become part of the qualitative inquiry in a big way, but much of her own work in research inquiry was performative, and of course, her own book and her work with others. So a lot of that's represented in that chapter. Sally St. George, Dan Wulff, also now trying to sort of look, inquiry is not just limited to what we do in the academy. It's going on all the time, every day in our lives. Why not try to take these ideas and try to put them in motion in that daily life? Then a chapter by I would call it the Cannon Keel group of 5 authors, but they've been so productive in terms of practices there. I marvel every time I turn around and hear about the Cannon Keel and Rocio Chavesta, Papusa Molina, and their colleagues. But here, where dialogue itself becomes a form of inquiry, which is important as simply observing something and writing about it or performing. So the way in which dialogue itself can enhance, enrich various forms of endeavor. Then you go to 2 really far out chapters, which are right at the edge of consciousness. No one knows how to develop them fully. But constructionist ideas have always had a little bit of difficulty with materialism. What do you do, not with the human world, but with the non-human world of material? How do we integrate that into the process? How do we think about it? Those dialogues still go on. But then you get these chapters here on transmaterial worlding. How about that for a title? Transmaterial worlding by Gail Simon Leah Salter. Tremendously imaginative chapter about how we can bring the world into our inquiry and make it part of it, and how we can transform with that in mind. Similarly, Tanya Mudry and Thomas Strong in a final chapter, and their approaches, socio-material practices, transmaterial, and it's really a lovely account of how material ends up into our accounts and how it enters into our practices and has to be taken. One has to be conscious of it and work with it systemically. So anyway, that's the chapters. I invite you all back in January because we could have some really interesting discussions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ken. Yes, I will put in the chat the dates for once a month. Each section of the book will have the section editor and the authors for an hour and a half dialogue with the authors. So that will be starting in January, and I'll put those dates in the chat box so you have them.
Sheila, can I add something to that? And for now, each of you, after the editor talks, if you have a question, please post in the chat. And at the end, if we have time, we're gonna try to start answering. Otherwise, we're gonna keep the conversation on our NIM page or our Facebook page.
Yeah, thanks, Celiane. So the third section of the book was practices in therapeutic professions, and Dan Wulff and Sally St. George were the section editors there. Dan and Sally are both board members of the Taos Institute and both professors, soon to be retired, in social work at the University of Calgary. So go on for it, Dan and Sally.
Thanks, Sheila, and nice to see everybody. Yes, our practices in therapeutic professions, that section consisted of 9 chapters and 9 very different ways of talking about therapeutic practices, and most of them not in a therapy room, which is awesome and makes it real exciting because these therapeutic practices can take place in lots of places. Even though there's this variability of location, the thing that brought them all together, as I read and read across, was that it was conversation, it was dialogue that became the center, the medium of, I'll call it connectivity, generativity, and transformation. I think each is an amazing read and an inspiring read, and I was real honored to get to read them numerous times and offer some suggestions. And that was interesting, but that was all online. So yesterday our book came, and that was really exciting that we got to hold the whole book all together finished. So I think it's worth buying. I think it's worth celebrating and continuing to celebrate all of the extraordinary contributions of social constructionist practice.
Our authors ventured to see therapy through a wider lens, specifically relating to how clients lived and worked in their social worlds beyond their immediate family or household. So the context of therapy was directly addressed by our authors to see how the situation of therapy actually impacted the work that was done. It was the structure of it. It's what was focused on, the discourses that were attended to. Some of our authors in this section, many of you will be familiar with because they published a great deal. But there will be some authors that maybe you have not yet heard from. So we think you'll be excited to hear from them. So it was a privilege to serve as editor for this section, reading and talking with the authors as they compose their works. As Ken was talking, it was a bit of a struggle at times because we had to live within certain conventions of publishing books. It was a bit of a challenge at times to narrow the focus or streamline, work within certain page limits. So in some ways, we tried to do justice to the authors and what they wanted to say, but at the same time, needing to have our marching orders about how one puts together a book for Sage. So that was a challenge. And so we wanted to not confine people, but yet at the same time, we were involved in confining them.
So we'd like to tell you who our authors were and their chapter focus.
So first of all, we had an article by Stan Whitkin and Christopher Hall, both social workers who applied the social constructionist ideas in the field of social work, one that Sally and I are involved in ourselves, and we're greatly interested to see how social work could embrace these ideas.
And we were glad that Harlene Anderson participated with us in writing about collaborative and dialogic practice. And every time Harlene writes, there's something new to take from it.
And we had a chapter by Dora Fried-Schnittman from Argentina. And that was a fantastic chapter introducing us to the ideas of what she calls generative dialogues.
Another author was Yasmina Sermon, and she wrote from a narrative therapy point of view, but about using the nested Russian dolls to help people understand things about themselves.
And Emerson Rasera and Carla Guanayas Lorenzi did an application of social constructionist ideas to group therapy work.
Lois Holtzman helped us better understand and visualize social therapy that she is engaged in.
And of course, Marilene Grandesso and her community therapy ideas. We weren't able to kind of have the singing and dancing that she does in her practice, but I think those ideas came alive in her chapter.
And we were also lucky to have Jill Friedman and Jean Combs contribute from their position of narrative therapy, always thought-provoking. So I urge you, even if you're not in the therapeutic realm, to make sure to read their chapter.
And then we ended up the section by Carl Tom, our colleague here in Calgary, who talked about family therapy and what is called, he calls the era of post-truth. So again, a very thought-provoking piece. I would also agree with Sally that even if you're not into the therapy practice arena, I think these chapters are written in such a way that there's value in them for anybody who is interested in the application of social constructionism in any field, whether it be teaching, healthcare, government, whatever.
So thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the privilege.
And we'll look forward to when we get together for our time together, many of our authors will be there to talk about maybe what their experience was like in working with us to try to get this thing put together in a way that we could put in this book form.
Great. Thanks, Dan and Sally. Thanks so much. The fourth section is on organizational practices in organizations, and Diana Whitney, who is a co-founder of the Taos Institute and the founder and former president of the Corporation for Positive Change, was the section editor. So Diana, I welcome you to say some words about your participation. You're muted.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. And thank you to all of the editors for this incredible book. It is a celebration. And working on the section on organization development was an absolute delight. And we've put together something that I think is incredibly valuable for those who are in the field of organization development and change, and those who are curious about it. The chapters that are in this section range from chapters about personal practices, personal behaviors. And Gita, and I'm going to just goof up everybody's name, Haslabow's chapter is the first one, and it really makes the shift that is so important from changing behaviors to entering into conversation with people so that they see how they make meaning about each other. So here we have a field of organization development that is so based on changing people's behaviors to cumulatively change organizations. And in each of these chapters comes through the key message. It's not about the people. It's about the way we talk together. It's about the kinds of relationships that we create and how we create meaning and a sense of authority through relationship. And so we also have Loan's chapter on leadership, which just does a fabulous job of showing us from a constructionist point of view how leadership is relational and dialogic. So we have in these chapters from the personal to the interpersonal to the team and multi-stakeholder. So another theme that came through all these chapters was the emphasis on diversity, multiplicity, how to work with multiple stakeholders who in and of themselves are multiple meaning makers and have multiple perspectives. And we see that in a number of chapters. And then we have chapters that are absolutely focused on the organization as a whole. And I know when I've done presentations at various Taos conferences, and I'll say, you know, we enter the conversation, the organization is conversation, that conversations are organizing processes. People find it hard to believe that you can engage hundreds and thousands of people, but these chapters give really good examples. And so if you're curious how the ideas of social constructionism go from a therapeutic setting to therapeutic conversations in the world to engaging with people who see themselves as constituting something called an organization. These are really valuable chapters, very, very valuable. So we see the relational, we see the conversational, the dialogic, we see the collaborative, and we see the creative. I could have started this section offering Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak's wonderful chapter on dialogic transformation, but I chose to end with it because embedded in this section, we have Amanda Trustin Bloom and Barbara Lewis, we have Daniela Zandi, we have a number of chapters that are whole system, whole organization. And Jervis and Bob really kind of tie this section up for us by giving us, quite frankly, both an overview of collaborative practices that are used in organization development, and also a launching pad for incredible innovation beyond what we now understand. So this collection of chapters holds tremendous promise. I think those in the field of OD will read the chapters, they will be able to see their work in these chapters. The work of Hae-Seon Moon, who puts together a new framework, and the work of Jervis and Bob, who put together a new framework, will give people a way to see their own work and to take it in some very new directions. So I'm thrilled with this section. And I want to say thank you to Celiane, who was truly a partner in collaboration. The time that we spanned in the working and writing and editing, there were times where I just couldn't be involved and she stepped in, times when she needed to step out and the authors just held their own. And so thank you, Celiane, for your partnership in this. And I think we've just got a great section for people curious about organizing from a social constructionist point of view.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. It is an exciting section, but they all are. The next section, section 5, is practices in education, and the section editor is Thalia Dragonas from the University of Athens, and she is also a Taos associate, of course. So Thalia.
Thank you, Sheila. It's nice to be able to see you all. Well, section 5 focuses on practice in education and is comprised of 8 chapters. A very interesting international group of 13 authors challenged through innovative examples of practices, the traditional conception of knowledge and learning. 13 in our case proved a lucky and auspicious number. Because all editors can testify that editing may prove to be a difficult job in the sense that everyone has to get working, moving on the same pace, and at the end we have to manage to come up with a cohesive whole that flows together, that chapters are all tied to each other. And I think that we did manage to come up with such an output. And of course, faithful to the constructionist principles, this section is a product of dialogue, as all are. And even though virtual, there was a dialogue between the authors, the senior editors, and the section editor, that is myself. Chapters were submitted back and forth, questions were worked through, changes were incorporated, and the final product is what is in front of you, in front of those who have the book in their hands. We do not all have the book in our hands yet, but I think you'll see how the chapter flows together. Some of us had already had the opportunity to work together on another Taos publishing venture on education from a social constructionist perspective. That was a volume edited by Ken, Sheila, a Greek colleague who's called Eleftheria Tseliou, and myself. That was in 2015 and published by Worldshare under the title Education of Social Construction. So in a sense, we had tested our collaborative skills and were not treading on unknown territory. Following up from what Ken started, what is impressive in the field of education is that all the innovative ideas education is grappling with currently are 100 years old. I don't know if that's true for the rest of the sections, but for our section, they're really 100 years old. It's in the 1920s that Dewey argued that effective education comes primarily through active participation in social interaction. It was Dewey who described traditional learning as imposed from the above or from the outside, while his view of the classroom was deeply rooted in democratic ideals, promoting equal voices among participants in the learning process. It was Vygotsky at the same time and in the same vein that saw the teacher-student relationship as an apprenticeship evolving in a community of practice. So these ideas were radical then, and they are still radical today. I mean, what has happened in education? Why is education so backward? I mean, it's really so backward. The constructionist view of education's primary aim being to facilitate relational processes within which teaching and learning take place is as topical as ever. So I think that somehow all the chapters are really answering this question: what has been so old and still it's so new? Why? Chapters in this section are grouped under 5 topics. One is school culture, and we have very provocative contributions by Rolla Lewis, by Gro Emerson Lund, and by Ingeborg Mayland. The other grouping is appreciative pedagogy and school counseling. So you have a chapter by Don Dahl on appreciative pedagogy, and a chapter by Mike Williams and John Winsdale on school counseling. Another grouping is learning difficulties and disabilities, and you have 2 very provocative chapters by Tom Billington and Dan Goodley and Harriet Cameron. Another topic is intercultural education, where I have contributed with a chapter. And the final group, the final topic is evaluation, where Sherto Gill and Ken Gergen have contributed a chapter on evaluation that is very much in the vein of the new book that appeared. It was launched, less than a month ago, Beyond the Tyranny of Testing. And it's really a very, very interesting and gripping volume. Chapter clustering under one topic, they may share constructioning practices with chapters under another topic, as is, for example, the case of appreciative inquiry or action research. As Ken said in the beginning, action research has always been there, but it's a very, very solid rock for education. The underlying theme in all chapters is that relational learning communities expand learners' and teachers' potential. I don't want to go more in depth because I know there's very little time, but I would just like to thank Rolla, Gro, wishing her to get well soon, Ingeborg, Dawn, Mike and John, Tom and Dan, Harriet, Sherto, and Ken for their creative and stimulating contributions. From the senior editor's side, Sheila and Mary were the collaborators in this process, and they were the ones responsible for the education section. I'm grateful for their support and advice during our fruitful collaborative relationship while getting this section together. And finally, I would like to pay tribute to Mary's memory. Besides the exchange of odd emails we had after that, this collaboration sealed my last interaction with her, and she will always remain alive in my heart and mind.
Thank you, Thalia. Thank you. It's very sweet. The 6th section of the book is Practices in Healthcare, and the section editor is Murilo Moscheta from Brazil. He is also a Taos Associate and Professor of Clinical Psychology at the State University of Moringa. And I know I mispronounced that. I apologize. Murilo, you can tell us how it's really pronounced.
No, you did it beautifully. Thank you so much, Sheila. It's a pleasure being here with all of you, as it was a pleasure working with you in this amazing project. I would like to thank you, Celiane, Emerson, and Mary. And I also would like to thank all the authors who I had the pleasure and the privilege of working with. You did a beautiful job, and what we have here in this section is a very important contribution to the field of social construction and also to the healthcare practices. We know that healthcare practices have developed tremendously in the last 2 centuries. We also are very much aware of the challenges we still have to face. And in an attempt to address all these challenges, researchers and practitioners around the globe have been advocating for a broader understanding of what health is, a contextually and culturally sensitive approach to patients, focus on interdisciplinary work, appreciation of primary care and health promotion strategies, and most of all, the emphasis on the relational aspect of care. So it is in this field that the practices described in the 10 chapters we have in the healthcare section emerge. So we were very lucky to be able to gather authors from Brazil, United States, Puerto Rico, Canada, Czech Republic, and they describe practices that addresses different contexts: hospitals, nursing homes, community groups, medical schools. They are also diverse in terms of the population these practices are oriented, such as elders, bereaved people, LGBT, people often named as addicts, professional healthcare teams, and professionals in training. So they beautifully illustrate the possibilities for action that unfold when we consider the relational dimension as the center of our care practices. So I would like to introduce you to each one of these chapters, but since we don't have much time, that's what we are going to do in our conversation with the authors. So I would like to highlight what I feel there are 3 common aspects in all of the chapters in the sections. First, these practices are very political because they challenge the role of diagnostic, and especially the effects they have in control, subordination, and the way they cooperate in the production of social exclusion. So these authors take this critique and put it into action through practices that are committed to producing care engaged in social transformation. Second, these practices emphasize collaboration. So they value language, dialogue, attentive listening, sensitive and contextualized responses, attention to detail, and the transformative power of narrative and storytelling. In doing so, they challenge rigid power relations, stifle hierarchies, professional isolation, and the resignation of those that we inaccurately call patients. And third, these practices are creative. They are oriented to the creation of new relational scenarios in which life, illness, and care may be different. These practices are committed to dreaming other ways of living, which are unpredictable because they are emergent, diverse and inclusive, and always collaborative. So I would like to invite everyone to read this chapter and to be with us in our conversation with the authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Murilo. Thank you. Finally, our last section, section 7, was edited by Murray Hoskins, who is Professor Emeritus of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria, and of course, a Taos Institute associate. Marie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Am I on now?
That's good.
Great. Sheila, I'm kind of aware of the time. Do you want me to hurry along here a bit, or are we okay for a few more minutes?
Yeah, I mean, people may need to leave, so we are over time. So
Okay, great. Well, first of all, it is wonderful to see everybody. I wish we could all be there together in person, but at least I can see faces and nodding and smiles. So nice to see everyone. Little did we know when we started this project that we'd be in the midst of a global pandemic. And I've always known that community is really going to be the answer to so many of our issues, such as poverty, the gaps between the rich and the poor, other kinds of human suffering, and that good, strong, resilient communities were going to be the answer and the antidote to some of these issues. So it's so timely right now that we need a strong community. And so this section, I think, is very important. And I appreciate that it's also the last section in the handbook for people to attend to. So in thinking back on the process that I engaged in, it wasn't without its challenges. I worried, and sometimes I worried at night. So I'm just going to tell you some of the questions that I kind of mused about when I went for walks or when I couldn't sleep at night. So there were some rough patches, some challenges. So sometimes language was an issue that needed to be wrestled with. Some words just do not translate well. And we were hoping to reach an international audience, as we have done so. So, for example, in Denmark, the welfare state has a totally different connotation than it does in a North American context. Sometimes expressions spoken in one part of the world could not be easily understood. So I grappled with that and tried not to put words in authors' mouths. So editing someone else's words, given the hegemony of English, or what some refer to as the dominance of the North, means one has to tread lightly and avoid trampling on important nuances. For those of us in the North, this requires some humility and generosity and some patience. And the third question that I grappled with, there are serious yet exciting cultural differences that, as some authors pointed out, have land and place-based epistemologies that can only be deeply understood in a particular and specific context. So I wondered if the ideas and ideals would truly resonate with an international audience. And I know our SAGE editor is worried about that too at different times. Would it be feasible or even ethical to transfer ideas from one context to another? Would making the ideas transferable water them down? What about appropriating other cultural ideas, especially for those whose wisdom has been minimized and or marginalized, such as the case with Indigenous peoples? Would the integrity of each of the author's programs be lost in translation? How might I, as a section editor, avoid taking away their voices and not write over their words? So these are some of the things that I worried about. And I think working through those challenges in the ways that the authors in my section did, I think are just real reason for celebration. It's not easy to take those pragmatic, practical community projects and then write about them. And also not only write about them in terms of the details of the pragmatics, but also in terms of making them sort of theoretically sound, which all of the practitioners in my section did absolutely beautifully. And there was lots of back and forth and, lots of revisions, of course, as there were with all of the sections. But I think what I found so exciting and rewarding was the willingness to do that. I had one author whose English wasn't his first language, continue to just keep working at it, working away at the drafts. And so it truly is an amazing testimony to people's willingness and their desire to be part of this community and to really promote the ideals and ideas found in constructionist thinking. So I just want to just quickly, because I don't think there'll be enough time to go into detail, but just mention the authors. So Gerald Monk and John Winslade have contributed a wonderful chapter on working narratively and from a social constructionist perspective. They've managed to help us think about meta-narratives and discourse in a way that gets us out of the entrenched kinds of conflicts that sometimes occur for people in communities. Janet Newberry has used her work in a tiny community in British Columbia in Canada to show us how to work relationally and work with inclusion. And it's an embodied way of working when there are some pretty fundamental differences in cultural differences. Celiane and Cesar, I hope I'm saying that correctly, remind us to honor knowledges from the South and to avoid importing perspectives that have little relevance to those in specific communities. Their placemaking approach reminds us of the danger of epistemological blindness. Jacob Storch and Karsten Hornstrop, they have boldly reimagined a welfare state in Denmark and have shown how professional identities can be altered and languages can be used to work more collaboratively with different professions. David Hooker's chapter offers hope for being more inclusive in community work. And his chapter is so interesting because it's not only theoretical, but he actually offers us some steps, kind of a roadmap for how we might want to work in community. Victoria Lugo presents an ethic of care in her work that is quite profound, to say the least. She's worked in Colombia where there's been entrenched conflicts. She works narratively and carefully and thoughtfully with stories of extreme suffering. Those stories are really heartbreaking. And this, she points out, takes time and patience. And when working in this way, and I loved her words around this, it's possible to defrost and agitate time so that it can do its job of healing. Eileen Wasserman and Aaron Taylor tackle the complex issue of identity politics. This is a brave chapter. We're provided with a concrete example of how to practice relational empathy when working with sharp and entrenched differences. And Kristen Bodeford and Peter Whitehouse, I love this chapter that they wrote. When Kristen first proposed the idea that she wanted to make it conversational, I thought, well, it may not work. It could, and it did. So it's a wonderful way of getting an up close and personal glimpse of what it's like to work in community around multi-generational issues and in different contexts, particularly related to healthcare. And last but not least, Dwayne Bidwell offers a compelling chapter that offers for the need for more action-oriented theologians who can embody a spiritual philosophy to work more ethically and compassionately with various communities. So just on closing, I'll just end. Okay, back to COVID-19 and our current crisis. During this pandemic, we now all recognize how a tiny viral particle circulating in a bat in China has brought the world to its knees. A real life example of the butterfly effect, and also a real life example of how interdependent we really are. The section on community in this handbook offers ways for us to live together despite our adversities. Without doubt, this is the time to celebrate this incredibly valuable handbook. Hats off to Emerson, Celiane, Sheila, and Mary for making this happen. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Marie. That was a beautiful way to bring this to a close. And I apologize to those of you who have commitments and we've gone over time. But Marie, your comments were just, there's a reason why community comes as the last section of the book, I think. And you've, I don't think I can summarize any better than you did. The sentiments of just, we are all in this together, and these chapters are great. And I want to thank everybody for being present today. And I hope you will join the dialogue with the different section editors and all the authors where you can learn more about the chapters. I don't think we have time for questions or comments, but I will ask my colleagues what you think.
The chat has been filled with comments.
Yeah, I'm also posting on the chat our Facebook page and our NIM page, where we can continue the conversation and post questions, share insights and ideas, and continue there.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for all the contributors. Thank you to, especially to all the section editors who work so hard, and thank you to all of you for supporting us. We look forward to seeing you at the dialogues with the authors.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You with us
Bye.
today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone.
Bye.
Bye, bye, bye.
Obrigado, obrigado todo mundo.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.
Tchau, tchau, tchau para todos os queridos.
Ciao.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, Marie. Thank you.
Bye, Mari.